Alrighty, guys. Hi. This is that cosplay guy, Michael, and you are listening to my first ever article that I've ever made, and hopefully it will not be the last, because that would be really sad. So anyway, issue 1 Cosplay History. Where it came from, and how did it develop into what it is today. And costumes have been around for more than decades. I mean, it goes back all the way to primitive tribes. I mean, you think of the tribal shaman. Their attire is usually will have allusions to animal spirits or the gods or anything like that. So it's a costume that depicts their faith and stuff like that. You got tribal dances and stuff like that. That's obvious. The dancers today do the same thing with animal costumes and character costumes and stuff like that. The warriors, yes, the actual warriors would, in an attempt to channel the spirits of their gods or the spirits of animals like the predators like lions or wolves, they will don like wolf pelts with the wolf head over the top, spirit of the wolf, and facial markings and stuff like that to be scary monsters. Years later and stuff like that, the armor, Japanese samurai armor, for example, and stuff like that, will be themed around to look like demons. So that can also be classified as a costume. But anyway, back to tribal history. So costumes were donned to help tell stories for the storytellers and the shamans, to visually represent something the wearer intends to portray. Be it a concept, a person, an animal, a deity, an entity. Primitive dancers would wear costumes to represent characters or animals. Shamans would wear items or totems around their neck, or earrings or whatever, their sticks. Represent deities, which were often animals and stuff like that back then. So, costuming started with the tribes. Moving on to Europe, more advanced civilization during Europe. Masquerade balls. Yes, that's right. The eyes wide shut, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, the typical drama icon of a mask over their eyes, the domino mask and stuff like that. The Victorian era dresses and stuff like that, the balls. That's what I'm talking about, the masquerade balls. Became a common thing in the 15th century during carnival season. That was between February to March, carnival season. And they sometimes used to celebrate marriages or military achievements or other dynastic events of the late medieval court life. It was a big thing, is what I'm trying to say. But they were usually reserved for the upper class. Well, the lower classes also celebrated carnivals, but they were on the street parades and stuff like that. So, of course, upper class had the big masquerade balls inside the big buildings and chandeliers and stuff like that. The stuff that Victorian era fiction dreams about. While the normal people did a la carnival out on the streets. Also in costume, in the masks and stuff like that. They just weren't allowed indoors. Masquerade masks had many uses, including hiding one's identity. So it was used as an excuse to be able to do what you feel you want without society's expectations, because no one knew who you were underneath the mask. It was the original internet's anonymity. Back in the day, without the internet and stuff like that, you had a mask. No one knew who you were, so you could act the fool, you could act the boisterous lewd. You could do what you want. This was the time of Joan of Arc. Japan's Sengoku War with Nobunaga, Hideyoshi Toyotomi, Tokugawa was happening during this time. And Christopher Columbus lands in America also during this time. So masquerade balls were around about those eras. By the 16th century, they were extended into public costume festivities in Italy during the Renaissance. So started in England, and it's now moved across the river into Europe and Italy and stuff like that. Masquerade balls. Elaborate dances were held by members of upper classes, which were particularly popular in Venice, and were famed for being rife with decadence and gluttony, and a large amount of lust, again, due to the anonymity, embarrassment, or fear of reprisal for lewd acts and stuff like that, were pushed aside, because, again, you're wearing a mask, no one knows who you were, you could grope a boob. If you want to, you could grope your own boob. Got a mask, no worries. With the fall of the Venetian Republic at the hand of Napoleon Bonaparte at the end of the 18th century, the use of masks during festivities began to decline and disappear in Venice. So, Napoleon killed the masquerade ball. Bastard. 18th century, a Swiss count named John James Heidegger, sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, brought Venetian balls and costumes to public dances in London. So it started in Europe medieval, moved to Venice in Italy, changed, and then moved back to London. Costumes and public dances in London. People masked in a fancy dress mingled with the crowds in these semi-public affairs. It was all outdoor now. The event's reputation for unseemly behavior and unescorted women. That's right, women were walking around on their own without a man escorting them and telling them what to do. Chaperoning them, protecting them, and telling them what to do. Modern women. Such controversy. What can I say? Created a significant anti-masquerade movement. So there were people complaining about costuming even all the way back then. So it was too much for them even back then. So you can't win. The anti-masquerade writers held that the events encouraged immorality and foreign influence. However, the masquerades continued to survive as semi-private, that's invitation-only, events. This was during the era James Cook discovered Australia and the US Declaration of Independence was signed. Alrighty. Moving further along the timetable, costume parties or fancy dress parties also became famous in the 19th century in Britain. And costuming guides of the period featured mostly generic costumes, whether that was national costumes or abstract concepts, because fiction, or at least visual fiction, wasn't a thing then, so they did not have images of characters to base their costumes off of. So most of the costumes were either fancy, well-sewn dresses, or their outfits were depicting old plays, like Greek plays, so togas and whatnot. Some people dressed up as Zeus, or they were dressing up as concepts, or weather patterns, or stuff like that. So deities. So visually, it was a smorgasbord visually. 1877 in France. Jules Verne, author of Journey to the Center of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and Around the World in 80 Days for those playing at home, created the Bal Travesti masquerade, which was attended by Verne fans wearing costumes from his science fiction books. 1891, as production of the automobile for public consumption begins, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle publishes the first Sherlock Holmes story. The Vril Ya Bazaar and Fate was created. Now, the Vril Ya Bazaar and Fate is coined as the first ever example of what will become a modern day convention. It was held at the Royal Albert Hall between March 5th and 10th in 1891. It was a themed fundraiser for a popular science fiction novel titled Vril, The Power of the Coming Race, hence Vril Ya Bazaar. And it included a number of attendees who dressed up as the characters in the science fiction thing. It was big. It was huge. People dressed up to get into the spirit. They wore wings. Others chose ancient Greece or Egyptian garb. A packed program of performers kept audiences entertained. There were magic shows, dramatic readings, concerts by the ladies' guitar band. I've got to double check that. I wasn't sure they had guitar bands back then. Organ recitals and much, much more. Stalls around the hall's perimeter offered activities like indoor fishing and palmistry, that's palm reading. A demon dog said to read minds also attended. And plenty of peculiar shopping options. And now the downside. All of this was too much for general audiences. That's right. This entire fate was, remember, a fundraiser for a science fiction novel. It did not raise enough money. They spent so much money on the entertainment and stuff like that they couldn't fund. Yeah, it was considered a failure at the time. So, it really are bizarre. Moving on, 1908. A couple from Cincinnati, Ohio, named Mr. William A. Fell and his wife wore a Mr. Skygack and Miss Diana Dill Pickles costumed to a masked skating carnival. Now, for those of you that do not know who Mr. Skygack and Miss Diana Dill Pickles are, they are newspaper cartoon characters. So you look in your local black and white newspaper in the section that has like Phantom, Garfield, Hobbs and Shaw, The Wizard of Id. So back in 1908, there was a popular comic strip in the newspaper of Mr. Skygack. He was a Martian who come to Earth to observe and commentate Earth culture, pretty much. And yes, hilarity ensues. So anyway, 1908, Mr. A. Fell decided to go to a skating rink event and dress up as Mr. Skygack, and he is now recognized as the first character costumer. 1910. March 1910, a woman in Tacoma, Washington, took first prize at a masquerade ball dressed as another Mr. Skygack. The woman's unusual costume had been a hit with the locals, and seeking to drum up a little interest in his business, her friend, Mr. Otto James, borrowed the suit and proceeded to walk up and down a busy Tacoma street while wearing it, reportedly to advertise his ice skating rink. Unfortunately, despite the costume's success at the masquerade ball, the people of Tacoma and the police of Tacoma weren't quite ready for public costuming, and James was arrested on charges of public masquerading. But he was released on a $10 bail. So, there you go, 1910. Mr. Otto James was the first character costumer arrested. 1912, 2 years later, a man named August Olson wore another Mr. Skygat costume at a masquerade contest in Tacoma, Washington. He won first prize. What I'm saying is Mr. Skygat was very popular. The first popular cosplay costuming character trend. 20 years later, let's move on. 1936. A group of science fiction fans from New York and Philadelphia got together to meet, talk, and share their interests in science fiction material, and later dubbed this get-together as the first science fiction convention. However, this convention was neither pre-planned nor had public invitations issued. Many do not consider this get-together to be classified as a typical convention due to this. However, it was during this get-together that the idea for what will become the World Convention was first conceptualized. The next year, 1937, the same year that the first issue of Detective Comics is published, and King George VI and Queen Elizabeth I are coronated at Westminster Abbey, London. The Leeds chapter of the Science Fiction League holds what has been recognized as the world's first planned and advertised science fiction convention. But it sounds more exciting than it actually is. It is no real Yars Bazaar. Conventions back then were pretty much what we'd classify as public lectures. It was just pretty much a meeting between a group of maybe 10 or 12 men, and so yeah, it was dull. But it was a meeting. I mean, maybe the guys that were invited there actually found some interesting things, but you know, it wasn't exactly a party. So yeah, 1939, July 2nd and 4th at Caravan Hall, New York City, the first World Science Fiction Convention is held, with Mr. Forrest Ackerman and Miss Myrtle R. Morojo Douglas dressing up in what is considered the first character costume in a convention. So yeah, 1939, Forrest Ackerman and Myrtle R. Douglas are listed as the first convention character cosplayers. The grandparents of cosplay, if you will. Remember those names, they're big people. Next year, 1940, the second World Science Fiction Convention is held. More people arrive in fan costuming this time. So in the previous year, the previous World Science Fiction Convention, stuff like that, everyone just rocked up just like normal people and stuff like that. That costuming wasn't a thing. And yeah, Forrest Ackerman and Myrtle Douglas decided to dress up for the occasion and accidentally, I guess, became the first costumers. And people liked it. And so the next year following, a lot more people came in dressed up, and they started a trend. So many people showed up that an impromptu masquerade competition was held, with David Kyle winning, having dressed up as Ming the Merciless. And yes, it was what we would consider today to be yellowface. But back then, just white people dressing up in different ethnicities was considered fine. So, Ming the Merciless won the first masquerade convention competition. Okay, 1940. The third World Science Fiction Convention is held. And with it, the first official costuming competition, held with a prize of $3, which translates somehow to $55 in modern time. A man named Walter Doherty won the $3 prize with a costume that was dubbed the $1,000 costume. Uh, the reason that it is described as the $1,000 costume is that it was made out of surplus plexiglass from an aeroplane manufacturing factory, uh, which at the time was considered to be an expensive material to use for a fan costume. It was pretty much see-through armor he was wearing. Okay, moving to 1952. The first naked cosplay appears at the 10th World Con. So yeah, naked cosplay. Someone rocked up. I really have very vague information on this. I don't know if it was a guy. I don't know if it was a woman. But apparently someone decided to rock up fully naked and got away with it. So maybe they were costuming as Adam or Eve or something. I don't know. Or maybe Leonardo da Vinci's human portrait scale. So. Inventive. Anyway, first naked cosplay, 1952. 1955. Members of the Liverpool Science Fantasy Society attended the first Citricon in Catterington, Britain, wearing costumes, and continued to do so in subsequent years. Any of the conventions at Catterington, England, henceforth named Citri due to the Roman name for the place. So yeah, that's the first costuming in England, 1955. 1956, Forrest Ackerman. If you're paying attention, Forrest Ackerman, that's the grandpa of fan costuming. He returns to the convention to report for Fantastic Universe magazine, and reports that Olga Ley, wife of writer and scientist Willy Ley, won for most beautiful costume. So Olga Ley was famous for making her own dresses and stuff like that. Big, beautiful gowns. Every convention, something new, something fantastic. She was a fashionista. But again, she didn't really base anything on characters, or I think she did some on concepts and stuff like that, but most of her gowns were based back in the Masquerade Era of Europe and England. But yeah, she's pretty much listed as the first of the great costumers, Olga Ley. So she was a famous icon before Kamoi Cosplay, before Yaya Han, before Linda Lay. So she was a cosplay celebrity. Sorry, words. Cosplay celebrity in 1956. Okay, moving right along, 1956, the Costumers Guild is created to help protect the interests of costume makers and costume wearers. 1957, the 15th World Science Fiction Convention brought the first official convention masquerade to the United Kingdom. Before that, it was all in America. Right, so how the World Science Fiction Convention works is that it's a bit like the Olympics. Each year, a committee that runs the World Con, or World Science Fiction Convention, they get together to decide, or vote or decide on which country the World Convention will be held next. So it actually moves around the world. It doesn't have a fixed location like Dragon Con or San Diego Comic Con, or like the Olympics, they vote where the con's going to be held the next year and stuff like that. And back in those days, the 1950s, whatever like that, wherever Worldcon went, it brought its culture with it. So science fiction, or in this case, costuming. And it kind of was the spark that started the fire for that culture in that country. So, yeah, like England, as soon as Worldcon went to England or United Kingdom, that's pretty much when costuming was ultimately born for them. Modern fan costume, character costuming. Same thing can be said for Australia. The origins of costuming and cosplay in Australia starts with the Worldcon coming to Australia. Yeah. 1962, the 20th Worldcon. It's been noted because a costumer's gun prop, or it was a laser blaster, got a bit extreme. This prop fired a jet of real flame in a public convention space. It was after this incident that new rules for costuming were made. This one led to just fire in general being banned from conventions, which is why you cannot wear that fire-wreathed Mockingjay dress to a convention anymore, no matter how accurate you may want it to be. It's also why people cannot accurately dress up as the Human Torch, because fire is banned. Not because setting yourself on fire is just generally a health risk, but anyway. 1963. Bruce Pells appears in costumes based on existing characters. This is another costuming celebrity. Bruce Pells, known for his character costumes. He dressed as Fafhrd from the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories. He also dressed as a heavy trooper from the Dragon Masters. He won awards for both prizes, and costuming began to adapt more and more to existing material because of his influence. So before that, it was people like Olga Lay, fashionistas, wearing big concept-themed based gowns and suits and stuff like that. But so character-based costumes were rare and far between. And until Bruce Pells started actually winning competitions. And so people who wanted to win the competitions started copying him because they figured that he was onto something. If he could win with a character competition, I guess I will also use a character costume. And more character costumes were started to being worn because of that. Alrighty, here's a big year for the pop culture fans. 1966. Can anyone tell me what happened in 1966? Star Trek debuted in 1966 and it changed fandom forever. It brought in tons of new science fiction fans to these science fiction conventions and stuff like that. No longer were science fiction conventions limited to novels and little pulp fiction magazines. We suddenly were getting visual media from television shows. But these new Trekkies, they probably weren't called Trekkies back then, but Star Trek fans, flocked to these science fiction conventions, and they dressed up in the Star Trek uniforms. So the uniforms of the Federation were extremely easy to make or replicate and wear. They were very comfortable, very comfortable. And so a lot of people started wearing Federation uniforms and stuff. I mean, yes, I'm sure a lot of people also dressed up as Klingons and Vulcans. I mean, Vulcans is just the ears, right? So it's still got the uniform. But, so yeah, Star Trek Federation uniforms were the first huge cosplay trend. Character-wise, you know how, yeah. Huge explosion of Starfleet uniforms. This was also when the concept of the hallway costume started. So before that, costumes were made for Masquerade, for the competition, to win the competition and stuff like that. But they were not built and designed purposely just for general wearing throughout the convention until the Star Trek fandom. Because again, Starfleet uniforms, extremely comfortable. And so yeah, Starfleet uniform, first hallway costume. 1972, the 30th Worldcon. Artist Scott Shaw wore a costume composed largely of peanut butter to represent his own comic character called the Turd. That's right. A man was walking around the 30th World Convention covered head to toe in peanut butter. That's right, they made a new rule not to wear messy substances as a costume element for your costume. So yeah, 1972, the costume The Turd. Infamous costume. Very messy. Although if you love peanut butter, very tasty. 1974. In its 4th year, San Diego Comic-Con, as it was then known, begins staging its own masquerade. 1975. In Japan, Comic Market, later known as Comiket, is launched, creating a venue for self-published manga, known as Doujin. It was a fan convention, and in this environment, what will become known as cosplay started to flourish. Also in 1975, with the release of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, audience members began dressing as the characters from that movie. Things start to get a bit more eccentric, with a lot of Transylvanian transvestites and corsets and fishnets and wigs and boas, feather boas, start adding to the mix of ball gowns and Starfleet uniforms and peanut butter turds, and it's becoming a menagerie in these conventions. 1978. The first documented case of anime costuming at a fan event in Japan was at Ashinokon in Japan's city of Hakone. At this science fiction convention, a woman known as Mari Kotani wore a costume based on the cover art for Edgar Rice Burroughs' novel A Fighting Man of Mars. However, due to her being known as a fan of the manga Triton of the Sea, her costume, so her science fiction costume that was based on an image of a science fiction novel, European science fiction novel, was mistaken as a manga character called Triton. So she was accidentally identified as costuming as a manga character, and people saw her do this, and suddenly it started a trend in Japan of other people dressing up as manga and anime characters. So Miss Mari Kotani accidentally became the first manga character costumer. 1979 to 1980. The anime series Mobile Suit Gundam is released, 1979, and the manga series Urasei Yatsura is released in 1980. These two created a huge boom in character cosplays in Japan. So Mobile Suit Gundams, or the first of the full robots, and the fleet uniforms. And the main character of Urasei Yatsura, Lum, her name is Lum. She is well known for wearing a leopard print bikini. Due to no clear policies on dress codes or designated areas to cosplay, residents who lived near the event's locations began to complain about scantily clad characters like Lum running around. And yeah, so after that, the conventions in Japan started doing designated cosplay areas, because apparently not everyone wants to see a Japanese girl in a leopard print bikini. 1980, the Twinkie incident in Worldcon occurs. This was a skit. This was a competition skit where a competitor was force-fed Twinkies until they threw up. And that was the skit. So, yeah, after that, brand new rule, no foodstuffs. Also at 1980, it's a busy year. The no costume is no costume rule is developed for future conventions. This rule banned full nudity. So this is the official end of naked cosplay at conventions. Although partial nudity was still allowed as long as it was a legitimate representation of whatever they were costuming. What's classified as naked costuming did not stop with this rule, 1980. Costumers still rocked up with tits out and stuff like that, but they had to convince people that it was a necessary part of the costume. So like harpies, for example, were animal characters that were topless. So a lot of tits out harpies were still going on in the 1980s. But this is the first time the rule no costume is no costume was developed. 1982. Worldcon masquerades were so popular that new competition divisions are invented. There were so many people applying in these competitions. Competitions got so big that they then separated them. So the novice, the journeyman, and the master costumer divisions in cosplay competition were developed in 1982. Alright, 1983. A man named Nobuyuki Takahashi prints in a magazine the word cosplay for the first time. He printed this word, cosplay, in the June 1983 issue of the magazine My Anime in Japan after struggling to come up with a term that would sum up costuming. At this point, costuming in Japan had many different names. They hadn't settled on just one catch-all term that everyone used to refer to costuming in Japan. Until Mr. Takahashi coined the word cosplay. He chose the word cosplay as it was a Japanese blend of the words costume and play. However, this word would not catch on with the public just yet in 1983. Also in 1983, comic market event organizers begin limiting cosplay to the boundaries within Convention Hall, again because city residents were scandalized by people dressing up in weird character costumes. Cosplay culture also began self-policing at this point to protect their culture from negative attention from outsiders. So they began checking on each other to see if what they're wearing is appropriate, to not give their culture bad representation and whatnot. 1983, Costume Con, a convention dedicated solely to costuming, is first held. 1984, Captain Tsubasa is released in Japan, creating another increase in cosplay popularity due to the ease in which the character soccer uniforms were created. Captain Tsubasa is a sports-oriented manga and anime, in this case soccer. So yeah, all the characters wore soccer sports uniforms. So all the costumers in Japan were like, hey, easy costume. So everyone rocked up in sports soccer uniforms, and that was classified as cosplay. 1984, Mr. Takahashi comes back. He attends that year's 42nd Worldcon in America, Los Angeles, in California, as a fan writer. He was there to write about the costuming culture in America for his magazine My Anime. And with new photos and stuff like that, he came back to Japan and re-released his original article, dubbed Operation Cosplay. This was the article that he originally wrote in 1983. but people didn't pay any attention to it because it was, I don't know, normal, I guess. But he then re-released the article with pictures of Americans cosplaying or costuming, and it got huge attention from the Japanese costuming culture. And that's when they officially started adopting the word cosplay as their thing, what they do. 1985, the International Costumers Guild, originally known as the Greater Columbia Fantasy Costumers Guild, is launched. This probably isn't a big thing amongst the new kids in cosplay, but for those who were in the costuming era, the International Costumers Guild was the it's responsible for archival footage and generally helping to preserve the historic artifacts and culture of costuming. So basically big amongst the old cosplayers. I say old, senior? Amongst the senior cosplayers and stuff like that, the International Costumers Guild is a big thing. If you want photos of all of the original World Science Fiction Convention Centers and stuff like that, the International Costumers Guild has you covered. They have a full picture archive available on their website and stuff like that, and it's great for researchers such as myself. Thank you, International Costumers Guild. So yeah, they do good work. Okay, 1990. Sailor Moon launches a mass cosplay trend. In the West, in the East, there's Sailor Scouts everywhere. Okay, 1995. The internet is fully commercialized. This results in the formation of email, discussion forums, blogs, instant messaging, and other forms of communication that were not available in the costuming/cosplay community until this point. So basically what I'm saying is that the ability to communicate, to exchange information, ideas, tips and stuff like that, the ease of this distribution of information exploded with the internet. This enabled cosplayers access to information like never before. 1995. In 1996, the comedy Friends. I'll lay out the episode and stuff like that. Basically, Rachel and Ross talking about how to spice up their relationship in the bedroom and stuff like that. And she asks Ross if he had any fantasies and stuff like that. And then Ross admits that he has a fantasy of Princess Leia in her slave bikini from Return of the Jedi. And so by the end of the episode, Rachel appears in a Princess Leia slave bikini to spice up the bedroom relationship. This was on a publicly accessible comedy show. So this was for a lot of normal people, non-costumers, non-cosplayers. This was their first exposure to costuming, to cosplay. And this is why it's associated with sex fetish, pretty much, due to this episode of dressing up as character costumes. To spice up your sex life, you dress up as a character that you find attractive. That's where this concept was cemented in the mind of the normal person, thanks to this Friends episode in 1996. Okay, 1999, the first cosplay cafe in Japan is opened in the Akihabara district of Tokyo. The maid and butler cafes is what I'm talking about. Where you go to a small cafe and you're served by a girl dressed up in a full Victorian era maid costume complete with a persona. She calls you master or mistress and stuff like that, and then pretty much acts like a European maid. Same for the butler cafes, except of course the attendants are men dressed up as butlers. That was first created in 1999. 2003, the World Cosplay Summit is created in Nagoya, Japan. Again, it's a big thing. It's pretty much the largest cosplay competition in the world. World Cosplay Summit, 2003. 2007, Cosplay Deviance was made. Cosplay Deviance is recognized as the playboy of the cosplay community. Adult-orientated cosplay material. Pictures, movies, whatever you like that. Like the Playboy magazine, but for cosplay. That first started in 2007. 2009, cosplay celebrities begin to appear. Modern cosplay celebrities. We have Jessica Nigri, photographed San Diego Comic-Con in a sexy Pikachu costume. Photo goes viral as she begins her ascension to become one of the most known cosplay celebrities in the world. Other celebrities like Linda Lay, Kamui Cosplay, and Yaya Han also begin their ascension at this time. 2010, the International Cosplay Day is created. For those of you playing at home, International Cosplay Day is August 27th. Okay, 2012, the Cosplay is Not Consent movement is publicly launched. 2013, the Heroes of Cosplay TV show is aired. Heroes of Cosplay was a... it's not quite like Big Brother. I guess more like My Kitchen Rules, but for cosplay costumes instead of cooking food. It was very dramatized. But the entire premise was that this film crew would follow these big name competition stars, cosplay competition stars, from their concept of creating a costume for a competition all the way through to attending the actual costume and stuff like that. It was supposed to bring light to the cosplay competition circuit and stuff like that. Unfortunately, it was also heavily the events were heavily dramatized and some of them even staged, and it gave, again, this TV show was released to the viewing public, the normal people who had no idea what cosplay was, and it gave a kind of a catty, hard, competitive impression of cosplay community, but again, what can you do? And here we are at 2020. This was smack dab in the middle of the COVID lockdown, so all conventions and stuff like that were closed for quarantine rules to contain the spread of the COVID-19 virus. But in 2020, the Ultimate Cosplay Competition is held as the first cosplay competition completely online. So yeah, everyone used their webcams to submit their skits, record their skits and stuff like that. They used photographic evidence and stuff like that of their creation, of their costumes and stuff like that, and all of this was submitted online. Thank you, Internet. And that's how this cosplaying competition was held, because there were no conventions open. But the cosplay community still wanted to compete, and they still want to survive. And here we are in the year 2022. I have no more timeline news to talk about with you. I'm sorry for the duration of this podcast, which has gone for about an hour now. So I'll close things up really soon. I'm sorry if this has bored you and stuff like that, but at least now you have archival footage of this timeline. You can fast forward and back to a certain era. You can, yeah. Anyway, I'm babbling. I got to finish my coffee. Yeah. So let me know how you thought about what you thought about my timeline. If you think I missed any big events and stuff like that, please contact me on the emails that I've listed in the podcast, my blog and stuff like that. I'm also on Facebook. They're all named That Cosplay Guy Michael, so it's very easy to follow. I am not That Cosplay Guy Bob or That Cosplay Guy Damien. I am That Cosplay Guy Michael, in case you're curious. Again, babbling. Yeah. Again, I hope this was informative. If I've missed anything, please let me know, and I will research it and add it to the list. Because at the end of the day, this entire project is about researching, accumulating, and accurate information, and yeah, developing it and displaying it for archival purposes, so that maybe some point 3, 4, 5 decades down the track, if someone asks a question of where cosplay came from, here it is. Information. Anyway, I think we'll leave it here, don't you? This is That Cosplay Guy Michael. Thank you for listening. I hope to talk to you during the next article. Ciao.